Good evening. What a nice crowd. Tonight you're in for a special treat, but first I have some announcements. I'd like to welcome you to the Isthmus Jazz Festival. So many people are involved in making this happen, and it's a very exciting week. And a little self-promotion. Tomorrow night I'll be at North Street Cabaret with my singing improvisational group at 6. Okay, thank you to the Capitol Lakes Auditorium and all the people who are residents here, who are here for an amazing show. This year's festival is co-produced by the Greater Madison Jazz Consortium and the Wisconsin Union Theater. Can you hear me back there? Okay, good. This year's festival is made possible by the support from Dane Arts, Isthmus, Performing Arts Committee of the Wisconsin Union Directorate, Madison Gas and Electric, Prime Urban Properties, John and Carolyn Peterson Charitable Foundation, and the UW Credit Union. This particular concert is being underwritten in part by Pete and Jill Lundberg. We recognize them in the back. You can find information for the rest of the festival on the little handouts that are on your chairs or at isthmusjazzfestival.com. The consortium publishes an excellent free newsletter, monthly newsletter, and anyone who'd like to subscribe can sign up tonight with one of our very friendly volunteers. There is no photographing this evening. And if you would make sure that your phones are off, that would be great. The festival website can provide information about the presenters. Oh, that's a note to myself. Sure. So tonight's evening event, a celebration of the artistry and spirit of women in jazz. I think that's a beautiful topic. And I'd like to introduce you to the people who are involved here tonight, some of whom I only met tonight, and some of whom I've known for many, many years. So, let's start with Jess. Jess Courtier holds a doctorate in music history from the UW-Madison, and as the program director in music and the performing arts in the UW Division of Continuing Studies, she oversees community classes in music, dance, history, and the humanities, and teaches courses on music culture and history. Her research and teaching interests focus on historical popular American culture. And then we have one of Jane's students. Jane's been teaching for, well, we don't want to give away her age, but let's say decades. And one of her students is here tonight. She's a freshman. She just finished her freshman year at Edgewood High School. Oh, see, I didn't read that clearly. See, they need to get another MC next year. Anyway, Joelle Brown will be playing Mary Lou Williams' famous boogie, Roll 'Em, and she was introduced to Mary Lou Williams by Jane when she was about 7 years old. So I'm very excited to hear, what's it? 7th? See, I'm improvising. Now, Lori's got a book here. Lori Lang and Lori Lang and Lori Lang. Lori Lang plays the jazz-bass violin. She's been in and around the Madison community for many years, and she has played with many, many people, and she has created community by going out to the community and involving people, artists in residency, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is that good enough? Okay, that's Lori Lang. I'm not going to read Jane's because I've known Jane since the 70s when we were in elementary school, right? Yeah. Anyway, Jane is an expressionist musician. She plays what she feels. And I'm very excited to hear what she has going tonight. She has a PhD, which she does not flaunt, but I'm just going to tell you she has a PhD. Oh, so does Jess. And God, I could go on and on. Jane and I played maybe hundreds of gigs together, and it's such a pleasure to work with her, and I'm very excited to present The Gang.
Hello. Thank you all for being here tonight. What a wonderful crowd we have here. Thank you so much to everybody who's involved in organizing the festival and our hosts here at Capitol Lakes, and to all the sponsors who help support this great event. I will talk some as the night goes on, but I actually prefer to just start with a musical welcome. So this is a performance from 2009 by the great singer and bass player Esperanza Spalding. She's performing a Betty Carter number, which some of you might recognize. Wait till it's done. I'm going to rudely interrupt this to turn the volume up a little. Sorry. It's just if you can't hear it, it's not worth listening, right? Let's try that. Is that better? So I love that clip. I mean, first of all, it's a fantastic performance, right? She's such a great singer, and it's lovely to see her have such a great bass solo. And I love that she is a current active younger member of the jazz community performing a song that was composed and performed by Buddy Carter almost exactly 50 years before this performance. So let me give you a couple moments in history. In the 1920s, pianist Lovey Austin, whose name at birth was Cora Taylor, worked as a band leader, a session musician, a composer, an arranger, a singer. Her band was called the Blues Serenaders, and they accompanied many of the most famous blues singers of the day. She was, in fact, a studio musician at Paramount Records, which some of you probably recognize as a Wisconsin company. Based primarily in Chicago, she worked with so many of the musicians who traveled from New Orleans north to Chicago as part of the Great Migration. Folks like Kid Ory and Johnny Dodds and, in fact, Louis Armstrong. And yet, how many of you recognize her name, Lovey Austin? Only a few of you. I'm not surprised. I would have loved it if so many of you had raised your hands. In 1930, at the age of just 19 years old, Mary Lou Williams was traveling on an overnight train from Kansas City to Chicago on her way to her first recording gig with Andy Kirk's Clouds of Joy, and she was sexually assaulted on that train ride. In a private journal, she wrote, "I wasn't fit for anything when I arrived in Chicago that morning, but I went straight to the studio." The producer asked her to warm up a bit, and so, quote, "Out of my training and the way I was feeling the beat came two originals, Nightlife and Drag 'em," end quote. Unknown to her, the improvisations were recorded and then released later on, but she received no composer credit nor any money from the royalties on those songs. During World War II, the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, who were the first racially integrated all-girl jazz band, toured the United States playing great jazz, but while facing intense racism both on and off the bandstand. The band included numerous talented soloists, and they were enthusiastically received by black audiences wherever they went, but travel was difficult. While in the South, the Sweethearts often had to sleep on their tour bus because Jim Crow laws prevented them from staying in hotels. One of the band's few white members talks about wearing makeup on the bandstand to darken her skin, knowing that as a white person, she was endangering her band members. And she talked about living in fear that her sweat would cause the makeup to come off and she would be found out, or that the police officer might notice her blue eyes. So in some respects, these stories speak to the entire history of jazz, regardless of the gender of people involved. These are stories about innovative, creative, fiercely talented musicians who changed the world through sound. They built our country's musical identity. They responded to changes in musical style and recording techniques and popular culture. And they did this in the face of persistent and often violent racism. In other ways, these moments articulate the very different ways in which women musicians have been part of the American jazz world. Lovey Austin was well-known, respected, and influential during her time. She was a strong musician and a savvy business person and seems to have been a larger-than-life character. There are people who write about her like driving around in her car with the top down and wearing a fur coat. In fact, Mary Lou Williams saw her perform when Mary Lou was maybe 8 or 10 years old. And she said, "I remember seeing this great woman sitting in the pit and conducting a group of 5 or 6 men, her legs crossed, a cigarette in her mouth, playing the show with her left hand and writing music for the next act with her right." Wow. My entire concept was based on the few times I was around Lovey Austin. She was a fabulous woman and a fabulous musician, too. I don't believe there's any woman around now who could compete with her. She was a greater talent than many men of this period. And yet, of course, despite this fame during her lifetime, she's largely unknown. Mary Lou Williams also was a pianist who composed, arranged, and led bands, yet her gender subjected her to both literal and metaphorical violence. Despite this, she dedicated her life to music. to making it, to caring for her fellow musicians, to using music in service of larger community and spiritual visions, and to educating younger people about jazz history. All girl bands, and I'm using the term girl here because that's what the women referred to themselves as. They were created deliberately because these women didn't have other places to play music. They were kept out of the implicitly all-male bands, right? These are women who wanted to pursue professional careers in music, but they didn't have anywhere else to go. What were ambitious women instrumentalists to do except to band together, to use the stereotypes of the all-girl ensembles and challenge them at the same time? So there's lots of stories like this that I could use. And I realized as I was putting this together that I sort of used a bunch of dark anecdotes, and that's certainly not the only part of jazz history that we're going to talk about. There's so much that we could study in this area. We could spend lifetimes learning about the women in jazz, the history of our nation, how this music has taken root around the world. So what we are planning to do with this program tonight is hopefully introduce all of you to some musicians who you might not have known before, or encourage you to maybe learn more about them. To draw connections between women in jazz who've been active at different points in jazz history. To draw connections between women in jazz who have been responding to things in the culture around them, perhaps in similar ways, but at different times. And of course, the title of the program is a celebration of the artistry and spirit of women in jazz. So I'm going to try to talk some, but not too much, because what I really want you to do is see and hear these women play, right? So we're going to do this through a mix of showing some videos of performances, and then also we've got musicians who are going to provide live performances as well, which is really exciting. So the purpose of showing videos instead of just playing recordings is that there's something so great about seeing musicians perform, seeing the work that they're doing, seeing the amazing hands of these, instrumentalists especially. So that's our plan for the night, right? We're going to kind of jump around from time to time, but I hope the connections between our different examples still feel strong. So, I do this all the time when I talk. I got ahead of my PowerPoint. So this is Lovey Austin. I meant to show these while I was talking. This is Mary Lou Williams. And this is one image of the International Sweethearts of Rhythm. This is Little Hardin Armstrong, second wife to Louis Armstrong, in case you recognize that last name. She was raised in a very musical household. Her father played the mandolin. There was an organ in the house, which she started playing when she was 6. She took piano lessons in grade school. It's worth noting that she came from a relatively middle-class household, which is one of the reasons that she could take music lessons, and that was kind of unusual. And she learned to play classics, marches, hymns. She played in the church. She had one cousin who played jazz tunes on guitar, but both her mother and grandmother really disapproved of this. So there's a story that she was allowed to buy the sheet music for Alexander's Ragtime Band, but that her mother beat her with a broom handle when she bought St. Louis Blues. So that was a no-no. She studied music for a couple years at Fisk University in Nashville, and then her family moved to Chicago, where she got her first professional job as a musician. She was a demonstrator at a sheet music store, so the idea was that she could play the music and encourage people to buy it, right? She started at a salary of $3 a week, which was quickly upped to $8 a week because she was so popular and so successful. One of the things that's great about Lil Hardin Armstrong is that there was an oral history interview conducted with her in the 50s, so we have a great record of her talking about her own history. And she tells a story about one time when the great great pianist Jelly Roll Morton came to visit the store. So one day Jelly Roll Morton came in. He sat down and he started playing. He had such long fingers, and in no time at all, he had the piano rocking, and he played so heavy, the goose pimples were sticking out all over me. So I sat there, and I listened, and I stood up, and I walked around. I was so thrilled. When he got up from the piano, he did something as if to say, "Let that be a lesson to you, kid." And I said, and it was a lesson. Because after that, I played just as hard as I could, just like Jelly Roll did. Until this day, I am still a heavy piano player, and I attribute it to my hearing Jelly Roll play so. She too started playing with some of the New Orleans musicians who had come up from New Orleans. One of the things that she found out is that she could read sheet music and a lot of them couldn't, right? She got a job working at a restaurant as an underage performer. That was a problem, and she lied to her mother about it for a long time until her mother found out, at which point her mom would come and meet her at 1 o'clock in the morning when the shift was over and escort her home. I mean, it's at this point that she has a connection to Louis Armstrong. She had been working with Joe Oliver, the band leader from New Orleans. She married Armstrong and continued to be a pivotal force in his career throughout his entire life, even after they divorced in the 30s. How many of you are familiar with the song Struttin' with Some Barbecue? A lot of you, right? This is a great recording from 1927 with Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five. This is one of his early pivotal recordings. Lil Hardin Armstrong composed that piece, and she's not often given credit for it. In fact, she appears is the wrong word, she played on the recording, but it's kind of a great metaphor because you can barely hear her. The pianist's job in that piece is to hold down the rhythm, while all the soloists go off and improvise and do crazy things. And so you have to listen really hard to hear the person who wrote the piece and who's holding it all together. So because you can barely hear her play that piece, we are lucky to have our performers tonight who are going to play Struttin' with Some Barbecue so that you can actually hear the song.
Can you do this again, turn it up, and if you can...
The volume needs to go on?
Yeah.
Okay. right, I'm hearing that the volume needs to go up yet more. So jumping time, as I promised we would, to a different pianist, Joanne Brackeen, who is still with us. Oh, I'm glad when I hear, yes, that's great. Joanne Brackeen was a pianist who was born in California and, like Lil Hardin Armstrong, showed an interest in piano from a really early age. She was somebody, though, who stymied her music teachers and sort of got fired from them. But she started playing in public by the time she was 12. And by the time she was in high school, she was performing in a Latin music club 6 nights a week. So she was basically a professional as a teenager. She was somebody who was really, or is, I keep using the past tense since I'm a historian. She's somebody who, as a young person, was really inspired by the great musicians who came through the LA jazz scene when she was a teenager, and so she saw performances by people like Art Blakey and John Coltrane and McCoy Tyner. And one of the things she did to teach herself piano in this style was to transcribe solos by Bud Powell and Charlie Parker and folks like that, to study them and do self-education. In 1965, she moved to New York after having gotten married and performed with musicians like Chick Corea and Ornette Coleman. So she was establishing herself as this, bold, experimental musician, and at the same time, she was having children. And having a career in jazz and having children can be really tough to do at the same time, right? So she tells a great story about one night after she'd had, I think, 4 children and going out to see Art Blakey at a club, and how she got invited to be a part of the band based on this one performance that she attended.
How did the gig with Blakey come about? Oh, that's an interesting story. I lived right around the corner from this club called Slugs.
Oh, Slugs, I've heard this name, yes.
Tiny club. I mean, it was bigger than this room, but not that much. And it's still all over the floor. You could get a beer for $1, and all the major groups were there. Art Blakey, Freddie Hubbard, McCoy Tyner, everybody, Lee Morgan, everybody worked in there. And I lived right around the corner. So but I lived up like 6 flights of stairs, and I had 4 kids, and in 5 years, and they were really young, so I didn't get out too often. So one night I heard that Art Blakey was there, and I thought, I got enough energy, I'm going to go around and see the band. So I'm saying this because I was kind of spaced out. It was late at night, and I also got up early in the morning. So I walked in there, and here was Art's band, and they just sounded incredible. It was amazing music. And the piano player was sitting up there, but he wasn't playing. And it sounded like he should have been playing. It sounded like they needed the piano to play, with the energy that they were playing in right there. So because I'm so spaced out, I'm just only hearing the music. I walked up to the bandstand and said, do you mind if I play? And the piano player said, no, go ahead. So I started. It sounds funny, but if you ever have 4 kids and you're going 6 flights of stairs up and down for everything you're doing during the whole day, by the time you get to the music, it's just, you're so happy that. And that's what happened. And at the end of the set, he looked up and saw me, and I was hired. It was the furthest thing from my mind.
Right, so what a great story about this, material experience of being a parent of 4 children, and 4 young children, and this kind of experience of delirium/euphoria, of feeling so moved by the music, and then the just chutzpah that it took to go up on the bandstand, right? So let's just watch a couple minutes of her playing. Many of her compositions are very extended, so we're just going to grab a little solo from a performance she did at the Berklee Global Jazz Institute in 2014 on a night when she was receiving the Living Legacy Award. I'll just note that this band that's playing in this includes Terry Lynn Carrington on drums, who we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. So I love the way that that solo just builds and grows in complexity and intensity as it goes on. Joanne Brackeen tells another story in a different interview about playing something that was in an odd meter and trying to get members of her band to learn it. And one member of the band telling her that she had made a mistake in her playing. And in the interview, she says, well, I don't know for sure that was because I was a woman and the band member was a man, but she said she sort of felt like that happened to her sometimes, that her authority was undermined. So here we have somebody, who is as accomplished and technically, amazing and has this complexity to her music who got questioned in ways. So Lil Hardin Armstrong and Joanne Brackeen, of course, were pianists, but they were working in the context of bands, of course. And so I want to turn to talking briefly about all-girl or all-women bands. I mentioned the International Sweethearts of Rhythm. Between the 1920s and the 1940s, we know that there were hundreds of all-female bands. And we know this because folks who research things like show announcements and personnel ads looking for musicians to join bands and interviews and things like that can account for this. And these bands had names like the Ingenues, the Coquettes, Phil Spitalny's Hour of Charm, that was a radio band, the Prairie View Coeds, Ada Leonard's All-American Girl Orchestra, the Harlem Playgirls, Ina Ray Hutton and her Melodiers, that's Dears spelled D-E-A-R-S. So why would they do this? Well, as I said earlier, because if you are a young woman who has studied music, maybe enjoyed playing with other musicians in high school, and you want to make a career of it, what do? Right? This was a place to go. Not a lot of these bands made it really big on the national scene, but they fit into an interesting place in American culture of like novelty acts in variety shows. So you see a lot of all-girl bands in like vaudeville shows and things like that. One of the things that happened was that World War II made more space for women, all-women bands, right? Just as we saw with the industries, it's sort of the Rosie Rivet around the bandstand thing. Right? There were new spaces for women to engage in public professional activities. And in fact, there was some discourse in both the general press and the musical press about this happening. So Viola Smith, who was a drummer, actually wrote an article in Downbeat magazine called "Give Girl Musicians a Break!" exclamation point. And one of the things she said in that is, in these times of national emergency, many of the star instrumentalists of big-name bands are being drafted. Instead of replacing them with what may be mediocre talent, why not let some of the great girl musicians of the country take their place? And then there were responses to that in Downbeat. It was great. So, as I mentioned before, the International Sweethearts of Rhythm was the first racially integrated women's band in the U.S. It's a band that actually started connected to a high school in Mississippi that decided that they would raise funds for the high school by sending musicians out on the road, which has a long tradition. This was a high school that served a very poor community. And so in 1937, the Swinging Rays of Rhythm, which is the first name of the band, was sent out on the road to raise money. In just 4 years, they were traveling nationally, and they had a lot of recognition. They were, of course, traveling in hard conditions. They had hardly any money personally, and traveling is hard. And some students became more interested in playing the band than in graduating from high school. So in 1941, the band split off and renamed themselves the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, in part because it was a band that had African Americans and Latinos and Pacific Island members, and there was a Native American member. The first couple white members didn't join until a couple years after it started. And there's some great names that just tuck away in your mind. Anna Mae Winburn, who is that woman in the center, was the band leader. She had actually been leading an all-male band prior to this. I don't know how many of you can see the laser pointer, but this is Ernestine Davis, whose nickname was Tiny because she was kind of a big woman, of course. She was a trumpeter and vocalist and was very funny. Vi Burnside, right here, was a saxophone player. Willie Mae Wong, also one of the more well-known saxophone player. I should say that both Burnside and Vi Davis had played in the Harlem Playgirls, which is one of the bands I mentioned earlier. They were sort of unique in that they had a professional arranger working for them. They had some new compositions and they used some standards. The first white members joined in 1943, and although they were white women who had perhaps unusual experiences or experiences beyond the mainstream. Roz Cron, who is this woman in the center here, was Jewish and had played in the Ada Leonard Orchestra, and she's the one who wrote about wearing makeup on the bandstand and being aware that her presence caused danger for the other band members. They had enormous following among black audiences. They did USO tours in the US and Europe. They did recordings for the Armed Forces radio broadcasts on a show called Jubilee, which was directed at black audiences. Touring during World War II was hard, of course. I mean, I mentioned some of the conditions of traveling in the South under Jim Crow laws, but there were also gas coupon rationings, right? And like all other groups, even though they were relatively successful, they still weren't making all that much money. But they were great. They were super energetic, wonderful players. So I'm going to play a video that was made in 1946, and it was called a panoram, and it would have played in something that's kind of like a film jukebox, a little stand that would have been in public places where you could stick a coin in and see, I think it was a little personal viewer, but you could see a video of them. So this is Jump Children, which is, I think, the song that they were most well known for. It's not one where you get as much of a taste of the individual musicians, but it's great to have a film of them at all. Oh, sorry, I meant to show this. This is a promotional poster for them. There we go.
A real guy to Jump Children. When you feel low and you don't know what to do. When you feel low and you don't know what to do.
You can note that they have a really tight arrangement here. So this is Vi Burnside. So for those of you who enjoyed that, I would highly recommend checking out their version of the Gershwin tune Lady Be Good, which has an amazing long drum solo in it. It's really great. So that's a historical band composed of all women. It's not something we see a lot anymore, but there was a project led by Terry Lynn Carrington several years ago called the Mosaic Project. Terry Lynn Carrington is, yet another one of these multifaceted, multi-talented individuals. We know her primarily as a drummer, but she's also a composer and a singer and a record producer. She too came from a very musical family. Her father was a professional musician, so she talks about having a chance to meet and play with Dizzy Gillespie, Les McCann, Rashawn Roland Kirk, folks like that. Really, Her grandfather was a drummer, and she actually played on his kit for a while when she was young, which is pretty cool. She is somebody whose career she's done so much in her career. I mean, she played drums on the house band for the Arsenio Hall show. She's toured and played extensively with Herbie Hancock. She's played with musicians like Stan Getz, Wayne Shorter, Clark Terry, Cassandra Wilson, right? She's a band leader on 7 different albums, and a side musician on numerous others, and is the winner of 3 Grammys. One of the great things is she talks about being a percussionist and wanting to compose for instrumentalists. And she said something like, if you're a drummer, you have to compose really well for instrumentalists to respect you. So in 2011, she convened a group of 21 women musicians from different generations. So some of the folks involved include Jerry Allen, Dee Dee Bridgewater, Diane Reeves, Esperanza Spalding, Cassandra Wilson, Ingrid Jensen, numerous others. And this is something that she had to say about the Mosaic Project. The Mosaic Project consists of some of the finest female instrumentalists in the world, women with voices coming together to support and celebrate each other from a musical and social perspective. As with Mosaic artwork, the goal for this project is to vibrantly connect colorful pieces together to create something integral, using thoroughly composed song forms, some abstract improvising, and also the human voice. The Mosaic Project is cross-generational, cross-cultural, and though jazz in nature, somewhat cross-genre, which is pertinent because jazz is increasingly pollinated, allowing its language to metamorphose into something one group of musicians alone cannot claim. So the repertoire on this album is largely songs that she composed, but there's also an Irving Berlin tune. There's a couple songs by other members of the group. There's a cover of the Beatles' song Michelle, and a song by Bernice Johnson Regan, who was one of the founders of Sweet Honey in the Rock. So I'm going to play one clip from a live performance of a piece called Mosaic Triad. On the album, this is a piece that actually has 3 sections. This performance has just the first section of this, and it's great because you get to see some of the performers involved in this project. You see the tight arrangements, and you see fantastic solos, especially by Ingrid Jensen on trumpet and Helen Sung on piano. can't believe how hard Jane and I worked to make this program small enough to fit here. So I'm going to go on to talk about another collaborative relationship between Jerry Allen and Betty Carter. And I'll just note that Jerry Allen died almost exactly a year ago on June 27th, 2017. She was one of the musicians involved in the Mosaic Project. So Jerry Allen and Betty Carter, both tremendously important musicians, like all the folks I've talked about, very involved with many other collaborators. Betty Carter, known as a bebop musician, a scat singer, a great improviser, spent a lot of time with the Lionel Hampton Band, where she talked about having learned arranging skills there. The particular, and I'll say that Jane will talk a little bit more about Jerry Allen in just a minute. I'm going to play part of a song called Feed the Fire, which is a composition that Jerry Allen composed. And interestingly, Allen made an all-instrumental version of it, and during the same year, Betty Carter recorded a version that mixed instrument and vocal performance, both of those on albums that were released in 1994. So again, this is just part of the song, but you get to hear them both.
Are you enjoying this so far? Hope you don't mind staying late. So Jerry Allen, we're going to get to Mary Lou in just a minute. Jerry Allen, as you can see, was a great composer and pianist, and she did a lot of things. She did electronics. She did a recording with a tap dancer to bring that tradition back as well. She was a great admirer of Mary Lou Williams, and she performed and recorded a lot of her music. There was a movie in 1996, you might recall, called Kansas City by Robert Altman, and in it there's a scene of young musicians representing some of the musicians who were playing Kansas City swing in the Depression era. Jerry Allen played the part, literally, of Mary Lou at the piano. We were fortunate to have Jerry here in 2010 to perform for Madison's centennial celebration of Mary Lou Williams. She did a lot of performing for that here and elsewhere as well. So a program about women in jazz, there's one musician who stands out from all the rest, and there she is, Mary Lou Williams. She was a pianist and composer and arranger from the 20s to the 80s, and not only played in all different jazz styles, but also inspired and influenced other jazz musicians as the music was evolving. She wrote hundreds of compositions and arrangements and recorded more than 100 records. She grew up in Pittsburgh, where she learned how to play sitting on her mother's lap and was performing by the age of 7 professionally. She joined Andy Kirk in the Clouds of Joy when she was 19 and quickly went from pianist to composer and arranger. In fact, she was with Andy Kirk in the Clouds of Joy when that incident happened at the recording studio. Word spread, and soon she was composing and arranging for Benny Goodman and Duke Ellington and many others. Ellington called her perpetually contemporary and described her music as soul on soul. In the 1940s, she had an apartment in Harlem, which became a popular gathering place for musicians, which she mentored jazz greats like Thelonious Monk and Dizzy Gillespie. In fact, there's a funny story I got to tell you. Thelonious Monk, she loved Thelonious, and he was a little out there. So one day, they'd been over at her house, everybody had been playing, and she'd been listening to them, and they'd been doing their thing. And everybody left, and she went to go to bed, and she sat on the edge of the bed and noticed there's somebody in it, and she jumped up and screamed, and it was Monk, and he ran into her closet to hide. So she opened the closet and said, "Monk, what y'all doing?" And he said, "We scared me. I got tired, so I came in here to take a nap." So in 1945, she wrote an extended work called Zodiac Suite, and it was all the signs of the zodiac, and then it was for certain musicians who were in that sign. It was performed by a jazz orchestra at Carnegie Hall in 1946. She founded her own recording label, called it Mary Records, which was the first to be started by a woman. She also established the Cecilia Music Publishing Company to publish her work. Her legacy includes the Mary Lou Williams Foundation, which she established shortly before her death in 1983. The foundation helps children and young adults learn about jazz. Also, the Kennedy Center hosted the Mary Lou Williams Women in Jazz Festival for many years, and Duke University created the Mary Lou Williams Center for Black Culture. She played all styles and eras of jazz, so she decided to perform and record a history of jazz. The recording is on the Smithsonian Folkways label. We're going to see a video that I happened to find. I was astounded to find this. Steve, you're going to love this. It's a video of that performance. I don't remember where it is, but it's in front of an audience. I think it's at like a Montreux Jazz Festival or something. So this is Mary Lou Williams. Oh, and by the way, she's playing examples, and they're all compositions of hers to demonstrate these different styles. So here's just the first part of Mary Lou Williams' History of Jazz.
strong left hand to play the spirit.
That was Nightlife. I've tried to play it. Never mind. Lori and I are going to perform one of her compositions. I'll tell you a little about it. You can come up and get ready. Mary Lou was in Europe in the early 50s, and it wasn't a good experience. And she came back in 1954, decided she was going to give up playing. She took a hiatus and joined the Catholic Church. 2 priests and Dizzy Gillespie joined forces to convince her to return to playing. And that was the Newport Jazz Festival, 1957, with Dizzy Gillespie. Throughout the 60s, her composing concentrated on sacred music. One of the masses, called Music for Peace, was choreographed by Alvin Ailey and performed by the Alvin Ailey Dance Theater as Mary Lou's Mass in 1971. About the work, Ailey commented, "If there can be a Bernstein Mass, a Mozart Mass, a Bach Mass, why can't there be Mary Lou's Mass?" Yeah. In this period, she worked with youth choirs to perform her works, including a Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, the first jazz piece to be performed there. She set up a charitable organization and opened thrift stores in Harlem, directing the proceedings along with 10% of her own earnings, which wasn't much, to musicians in need. As a 1964 Time article explained, Mary Lou thinks of herself as a soul player. As she said, "I am praying through my fingers when I play. I get that good soul sound, and I try to touch people's spirits." She succeeded. So Lori and I are going to play something from Music for Peace by Mary Lou Williams. I gotta see where we are. Okay. Cool. Who here has heard of Sweet Emma Barrett? Not surprising. I hadn't heard of her either until Joan Wildman told me about her. I don't know if you know Joan Wildman. She was a university professor for many years, and I'll tell you more about her later because we're going to hear something from her too. Sweet Emma Barrett was a self-taught New Orleans pianist. She was born in New Orleans in 1897 and played traditional New Orleans stride and boogie piano. She started working with the original Tuxedo Orchestra in 1923 and went on to work with many others, including the Preservation Hall Jazz Band. She was nicknamed, you'll love this, Bell Gal, because she wore a red skull cap and garters with Christmas bells around her legs that jingled in time with the music as she stomped her feet, which you're going to see. In 1967, she had a stroke, but continued to play just with her right hand until her death in 1983. So I talked to Joan Wildman about it. She actually went to New Orleans around 1980. She was doing research on stride piano. So she went and saw Sweet Emma with the Preservation Hall Jazz Band. And in an email she told me just the other day, I couldn't remember what she had told me back then. So she said, when I saw Sweet Emma at Preservation Hall, I'm sure I told you about the drama of her walking to the piano very slowly. Then, after sitting down, she spent a chorus or two while the other musicians played, taking off her gloves and putting her hanky on the piano. And suddenly started to play great stuff with her right hand only. So we're going to see Sweet Emma Barrett. This is in a television program. She's with members of the Preservation Hall Jazz Band. This is from the 60s, shortly before she had her stroke. She's not looking well here, but she loved to play anywhere she could, especially New Orleans. You can see how much she loved to play and put on a show. So this is authentic New Orleans jazz featuring Sweet Emma Barrett. So oh God, that was great. I love the part where he gets something starts dancing. Makes you want to do it. Joan Wildman, as I told you about, was a university professor. She's a jazz pianist and composer, and she knows tradition better than anyone. So Joan has also done a lot of experimentation, like playing in the strings of the piano and working on developing electronic music using synthesizers. One day, maybe about 10 years ago, I was at her house and she said she had to show me the newest thing she was working on, which was computer animation. She had a computer program that allowed her to draw and create animations, and then she would add electronic music to it. She's done a few public performances with live music, one of which was with Joan on synthesizer and Roscoe Mitchell on saxophone. We're going to see and hear one of her computer animations in which she's added electronic sounds along with some New Orleans-style piano. The title of it is New Orleans After Katrina. Here's Joan's description of it. The animation is more theater than a musical presentation, my own attempt at drama. It's not necessarily meant to be pleasant. I tried to show the horror of the hurricane, all the chaos, the bodies, the water, and the loud siren denoting the hollowness of law and order at the time. Behind all this is the softer but persistent thread of New Orleans history and tradition, the music.
When Jane and I first started talking about this program, it was not long after the March for Our Lives, marches that were happening around the country. And one of the things that we talked about was being really inspired by all the youth leaders in our communities, locally and nationally, and sort of thinking about the many ways and times that musicians have responded to things happening in society and culture. So the last little section of this presentation is in that vein. And I'm actually going to play 3 songs in a row without talking between them, because they are 3 songs that sort of need to occupy their own space. So the first song is by Billie Holiday, who probably of all the people we've talked about needs almost no introduction. She's the name that even people who don't listen to jazz know, right? And we're going to play a recording of Strange Fruit, which she recorded first in 1939, marking the horrific history, and at that time still happening, history of lynching in the U.S., which claimed the lives of as many as 4,000 people, mostly black men, between 1880 and 1950. We're playing this here on the assumption that many of you probably know this song, but to see her sing it is devastating and powerful in that way. And I just want to note that it is really devastating to listen to this song. The song that I'll play after that is by Nina Simone, probably also a relatively well-known figure, somebody who started her musical career assuming that she would play classical music, and when she was rejected, among other things, she was not accepted to the Curtis Institute for Music, assuming that it was because of racial prejudice. And so literally kind of turned to playing in other genres in order to keep alive a career in music, and quite famously spent a lot of her life working outside of the United States because of the racial climate here in this country. She was vocal in her criticisms of political culture and contributed many musical songs to the civil rights era. We're going to play Backlash Blues, which is a song that uses poetry by Langston Hughes. There are a number of other songs, Mississippi Goddamn, Old Jim Crow, For Women, which is a song that in which she kind of embodies 4 different African American women at different points in American culture. If you know that song, you know it's a wonderful song, and I would encourage you to go seek out performances by other musicians. There are several performances where different women sing the 4 different personas, including one where her daughter sings part of it. There was also one done about 2 years ago by a Black Lives Matter group at Berklee College of Music, with young women singing and playing all the instruments, and it's so profound to see that connection drawn directly between music history and contemporaneous events and culture. And then after that, a song by Abby Lincoln, who again is somebody whose early career didn't necessarily tell us where she would go later on. She's somebody whose early performance life was singing, but was in things like supper clubs. She sang at the Moulin Rouge. She was in film. But her musical life had kind of 2 streams to it. She was, again, another musician deeply committed to the civil rights movement, and is probably well known for an album of her husband's, We Insist, Max Roach's Freedom Suite, in which she sang. That album drew texts from the Emancipation Proclamation. It made references to American slavery, references to South African apartheid, used radical sounds to express these ideas. There was screaming, there was noisy collective improvisation. She was also really active in composing her own pieces, and deliberately made pieces that were about subject matter that wasn't the standards. It wasn't all just like the love songs that young women would sing. It was about the world around her. It was reflecting her music, her experiences of the world as she grew into a mature adult. And so, she composed songs like People and Me, which was based on her experiences of traveling in Africa with the great South African musician, singer, and activist Miriam Makeba. A song called People on the Street about homelessness. She was somebody who talked frequently about spiritual matters and made references to African gods and goddesses and ghosts and ancestors. So really, one of the things that's great about her music is that she really expressed her worldview through her songwriting. All three of these women, I think, are in the tradition of 1920s women blues singers who didn't go in for fancy performances, but really used their voices to communicate passionately and directly about lived experience. So the song we'll hear from Abby Lincoln is from Throw It Away. We'll just hear part of the performance, and it was a live performance that she did. And this is a song that was actually based on her using the sort of Chinese divination book, the I Ching. And then after that, Jane is also going to play a piece that's related to responding to contemporary social issues.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the summer breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rock, for the tree to dry. Here is a strange and bitter cry.
and keep your eyes wide open. Let the sunshine through, 'cause you can never lose a thing if it belongs to you. There's a hand rock cradle and a hand to help us stand with a gentle kind of motion as it moves across the land. And the hands are clenched and open, give sunlight, love, and rain. So keep your hand wide open if you need anything. Throw away, give your love, live your life, each and every day, and keep your hand wide open. Let the sun shine through, 'cause you can never lose a thing if it belongs to you.
So I was choosing a piece for myself for us to play, of mine. And the one we're doing, actually, I recorded on a CD with bassist Hans Sturm, and I happen to have a few copies here if anyone was interested. I was playing this on piano one day recently and recalled the March for Our Lives in Washington, D.C. last March, where the high school students were demonstrating, along with others, for gun control after the Parkland massacre. I watched speakers on television and at the end was stunned by Parkland survivor Emma Gonzalez, who stood silent for what seemed like an eternity. Then her phone alarm went off and she said, "That was 6 minutes and 20 seconds. That was how long it took for the shooting to stop." My piece was originally titled, "Who Knows When Silence Begins?" And it's now subtitled 6 minutes and 20 seconds. Thank you. Lori Lang on bass. Okay, we're going to end the program now. This is Joelle Brown. She is a wonderful student of mine. I don't want her to go away. She's going to do one more composition by Mary Lou Williams, this time a boogie. She just finished her freshman year at Edgewood High School, and she's been playing this piece actually since 8th grade, I guess, right? 7th grade. I stand corrected. So I asked if she'd play it tonight, and she gave me a very enthusiastic yes. I will do it. Yeah. Joelle is a shining example of the future of women in jazz. So it's only fitting that we should end the program with Joelle Brown playing Mary Lou Williams' Roll 'Em.
A nice hand for these amazing women. Thank you for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Isthmus Jazz Festival continuing on tomorrow. Thank you, my darlings.